Okay, this video is to introduce the QR paper assignment. So this is an assignment that is due towards the end of the semester, and I want you to start thinking about it early so you can pick a topic and do some research and get questions answered. I want to stress that this is not really different than any other research paper except for one thing. So if you were doing a regular research paper, you'd find references and you'd build an argument and you'd support that argument with evidence. This is no different than that. The one way it's different is that there are specific requirements about what needs to be in there as far as quantitative reasoning. So there's a quantitative reasoning element that needs to be in this paper. Otherwise, it's just a regular research paper. So this is the assignment link on Moodle. There are three files here. There's the QR paper guidelines, so that's the Word document. There's a PowerPoint presentation, which I'll take you through quickly in a moment. And then there's a longer article about the principles of writing with numbers. So let's look at the assignment description first. So here is the guidelines document. So again, it's a paper with strong quantitative support. So otherwise just a research paper. It's a 1,200 word paper. Let me make this page width. And here are the guidelines. This is what must be in the paper. Descriptive title, introduction with a clear thesis statement. So I definitely want to see that your thesis is really well formed and specific, and that thesis is what you're focused on throughout the paper. You're providing evidence that supports that thesis statement that you have at the beginning. The body paragraphs, standard research paper. So each body paragraph should have a topic, and that topic should connect back to the thesis statement. It should be cohesive and, smooth transitions between the paragraphs. Good writing in general is what I'm looking for. But then there's the explicit use of quantitative reasoning skills. So this is what makes it slightly different than a normal research paper, although not that different. Because if you're doing a normal research paper, you should have good quantitative reasoning in there. If it's applicable, you should have good quantitative reasoning in there. But I do have specific requirements for what type of skills I need to see. So the first thing is there should be, and this is just one instance of each of these in the body of the paper. So somewhere you need to have one instance of evaluating a qualitative statement and then drawing a conclusion by considering relevant quantitative information. So let's say you were doing, this first thing that comes to mind is that you're doing a paper on the relationship between smoking and lung cancer. So a qualitative statement might be that smoking increases the risk of developing lung cancer. That's a qualitative statement, and there's plenty of quantitative information that you could use to back it up. You could cite some statistics on how frequently people end up with lung cancer when they are lifetime smokers, something like that. So a qualitative statement that's sort of supported by quantitative information. And you might have multiple examples of that. In any research paper, you'd probably see multiple examples of qualitative statements that are backed up with quantitative information. And the quantitative information could be a statistic, it could be a graph. Either of those things would work. Summarizing quantitative information presented in a graph or a table. So if your first qualitative statement is just a statistic like, 17% of people are this, then there needs to be another instance somewhere else that you're using a graph or a table and showing me that you are understanding how to read the graph and how to incorporate that as part of your argument. So you don't have to make the graph. It doesn't have to be data that you collected yourself. You can take a graph from another article or a table from another article that you're summarizing. It just needs to be included as evidence in your paper. And then the last quantitative reasoning requirement is that you discuss an example of the misuse of quantitative information. In any good research paper, you're going to be entertaining counter arguments, things that are alternative to your hypothesis or your thesis, and you're probably disagreeing with some of the statements that are made about that particular topic. So if you're writing something and there's nothing out there that's, misused information, or you don't think anybody's wrong about it and everybody's got the thing right, then it's probably not an interesting thing to write about. So in any interesting topic, there will be arguments out there and you'll disagree with something. So what I want you to do is find something that you disagree with, a statement that you disagree with that includes quantitative information, like it's a misused statistic, or something that someone's misinterpreting it or applying it in the wrong context, and then explain how you see that argument. So in your paper, a qualitative statement that's backed up with quantitative information, a graph or a table, and then a misuse of quantitative information, sort of something that goes counter to your thesis that you find to be incorrect, and then explaining why it's incorrect. They can be combined, so they don't need to be separate instances, but they all need to appear in your paper somewhere. And then at the end, a conclusion that summarizes your thesis, just as you would expect. There's some formatting guidelines here. The grading rubric, you can go through to see what I'm going to look for as I grade the papers. And then there are information here about choosing and researching your topic. There are some articles linked that will hopefully give you some ideas of things you could possibly write about. And I tried to cover a kind of range of fields of interest. If you find something interesting, there's a good chance you could turn it into a paper here. And if you have questions about your possible topic choice, feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to talk to you about topic ideas. Once you've selected a topic, to research it, my recommendation is to follow this plan. Read about it, do a lot of reading about it. Don't just find the first link that you come to and use that. Try to find a broad perspective on the topic by reading what's out there. Assess what you've seen, and then investigate. So try to follow this path here to research your topic. Read as much as you can about it. Assess what you've seen and investigate each of those things. Be critical, think critically about it, and then use that information to form your thesis. Now, you might have a thesis going in which case you're evaluating, comparing what you're reading to your thesis, or you don't have a thesis going in, you're just interested in the topic, and then you're using this process to develop a thesis. Okay, there's a little bit of advice about how to write a thesis statement, the formulating the thesis statement, formulating the thesis stage, and then giving your paper a title. So it's a small part of the grading rubric is the title. It's only 5%, but still that's 5%. And so you should give some thought to a strong title. And that title should be in relation to your thesis. So make sure it's a fitting title for your paper. Then the last part of this is some general advice about using quantitative support in your writing, and that builds off of what's in the PowerPoint. But there are 7 things listed here, and I will go. You can read about them here, but it's in more detail in the PowerPoint. So let me open that up now. So this PowerPoint goes through aspects of quantitative writing that are focused around those 7 basic principles. The article that's listed there, titled 7 Basic Principles, goes into even more detail. So you've got the short description in the assignment guidelines, then this a little bit elaboration in the PowerPoint presentation, and then even more. This is all derived from that longer article, 7 Basic Principles. One important thing before I move to the next slide, the audience for your paper is the class population. So if you're curious about how to aim the level of your paper, you're writing it so that other people in the class would have no problem understanding what you're talking about. So don't assume knowledge that they wouldn't know, but you can assume knowledge that they would know. Okay, so I'm going to go through this briefly since you have access to the PowerPoint. You can come back and read it and then let me know if you have questions. But the 7 basic principles start out with establishing the W's, and the W's are who, what, when, and where. And this is about putting context to the information that you have. And so with this one, there are examples given: poor, better, best. The poor statement, there were 25 million deaths. Nothing wrong with that statement, but it lacks information that you could be providing. Eventually you get to the best statement here, which is a much better elaboration of what this information is. When the Black Plague hit Europe in the latter half of the 14th century, so we're talking about when and where, it took the lives of 25 million people, young and old, city dwellers, and those living in the countryside. The disease killed about 1/4 of Europe's total population at the time. So I'm giving the number, I'm giving it context, and also comparing it so in a way that helps people understand it better. So what does 25 million people mean? Well, it's about 1/4 of the total population. So when you write with a number, make sure you're establishing the W's. When you give an example, make sure it's simple and plausible. The simpler it is and the more plausible it is, the better it connects with your audience. If it seems crazily complex, chances are people won't understand it. And if it's implausible, then people won't believe it. So simple and plausible is always better. And again, there's examples here. You can take a look to see how they differ from a poor example to the best example. Selecting the right tool for the job. So this refers to the type of quantitative tool. Maybe it's a single statistic, a percentage, a count, or maybe it's you need a graph, or you need a table, you need a chart to explain it. And this slide here kind of goes through how you select the right tool. And the basic thing is, what do you need the audience to understand, and how central is the information to your main argument? Because if you don't really need the audience to understand the information, then maybe it doesn't need to be in there. But if you do need them to understand it, then if it's not very important to your argument, you might just want to go through it quickly. So maybe a single statistic is good enough. But if it's very central to your argument, maybe you need more than just one number to tell that story. And so judge like how important that information is and use that to tell you what the right tool is. And so here are some guidelines. If a few numbers suffice, you can just write it into the prose of the paper. If the precise values are unimportant, but you want people to visualize it, then maybe you need a chart of some sort. And then if it's a major or minor point where people may want to see precise values, like they might want to look up a specific value, like maybe you're comparing state data, and they might want to look up the state that they're from, then maybe a table is more appropriate. Then they can see individual data points. But that's sort of a case-by-case thing. You need to know how that tool is used for the job you want it to be doing. Defining terms, sort of generally good in any paper to make sure you're clear about terminology. And in particular, when you're talking about things that are quantitative or technical, there can be a lot of jargon that people don't necessarily know, and maybe they don't need to know it. Now, if they do need to know it, you want to define it, and define it clearly early in the paper so then you're using it later on. If it's something you're only going to use once, then maybe there's an alternative way to go through it rather than giving some technical term that you define once and maybe spend a paragraph defining it, but then it never comes up again. So at the end here, ask yourself if the time spent to understand the term is justified. If it is, that's fine. Use a good definition and give that time to defining the term. If it isn't, then find another way to say it. Don't just introduce jargon for the sake of introducing jargon. When you have decided what to include as far as quantitative information and you put it into the paper, make sure you're not just giving the information, but you're also interpreting it. That goes back to the first slide here, this good example. They gave the quantitative information, they reported the data, but then they interpreted it for the reader by telling us how much that compared to the Europe's total population. So there are some other examples here: poor, better, best with one category to emphasize a trend, and then best in another category to put it in U.S. and international context. So what's best depends on what your goal is for using that information. But whatever the case may be, if you give some sort of quantitative information, or wherever you give some sort of quantitative information, it needs to be interpreted for the reader. Don't assume that the reader knows what it means. Tell them what you think it means. Okay, and then when you're doing this, you want to also specify the direction and the magnitude. So this is two ways of qualifying the quantitative information. The direction would be saying that, one thing increases and another thing increases. And then the magnitude is like how much. Is it a small effect? Is it a large effect? Give that context for the reader as well. So the example here, mortality and age are correlated. Okay, that's a true statement. Mortality and age are correlated, but it doesn't really tell the reader how. Now, you probably could guess. This is kind of an obvious one. So a better way to say this is, as age increases, mortality increases. Okay. But that's not very specific either, because we don't know yet quite the magnitude. Like, how much does mortality increase as age increases? Well, the better statement is, among the elderly, mortality roughly doubles for each successive 5-year age group. Now, that's a much more complete way of explaining the relationship that's here. And then lastly, summarizing patterns. So if you see patterns that are important to your argument, make sure you summarize them. And you can do that by following these 3 steps. Generalize, so you're describing the relationship for most of the values. Give a specific example that illustrates the point you're trying to make. And then also talk about any exceptions, because if you ignore the exceptions, that makes your argument suspicious. So you should discuss them, and if there's an explanation for why there are exceptions there, then talk about it. Okay, now some of this might be a little bit abstract at this point, but this is here as a reference for you. So what I would say is, as you're going through your paper assignment, follow the process here. Choose the topic, research the topic, get your thesis statement, and once you've collected the information, come back to these 7 principles and assess whether or not you're meeting the guidelines, whether yours matches more with the poor example, the better example, the best example, with how you've used it in your paper, and you can kind of use this as a way to cross-check. Okay, so this is the assignment in brief. It's due towards the end of the semester. It's not an especially long paper, but it's one that will require some work to get the background information, do the research that you need to do. I do want to talk more about good examples and bad examples of quantitative writing. So in maybe a couple of weeks, I'll check back in on this assignment, and we will take a look at some specific articles, and hopefully that will give you even better sense of what good and bad quantitative writing looks like. But for now, hopefully this is enough for you to get started thinking about the project, what you might want to do. Your first assignment is to pick the topic you want to write about, and then do some preliminary research. And if you have any questions at any point in that stage, reach out to me, and I'm happy to answer your questions, help you find a topic, help you work it into a nice thesis statement.